Really excited to introduce Jay McBain. For those of you guys that don't know him, he is world-renowned keynote on IoT, mobility, cloud, software, and everything channel. Oftentimes we were talking with Jay, he can bill upwards of 25K for an hour. So it's really a privilege to have him here. You can follow Jay on Twitter, through his blog, and doing some additional research on him. I saw that he's attended and visited 95 different countries around the globe throughout his life. Last year, he did an adventurous trip around the world where he hit 15 countries in 21 days. And these are many countries completely off the beaten path. And now that's pretty adventurous for many of us, but he did this with his entire family and his 2 young daughters. And Jay, I see that you are about to achieve the Traveler Century Club. So the question I have for you is, with these next 5 countries that you have yet to hit, which 5 are those?
That's a great question. So we in January had a trip planned to Antarctica, which would have been our 7th continent. But given COVID and given the only way to get to Antarctica is by boat, and there's only 4 countries left in the world that lets US citizens in at the moment, that one's going to have to delay. There's only 2 weeks a year you can go down to Antarctica, and we're going to miss the window in January, so it'll probably push it by a year. So we're going to have to rethink how we look at the map, but love to get traveling again. And I like to see the conference here in Jupiter because I am 30 miles south of Jupiter in Boynton Beach, Florida. On Sundays, I ride my road bike up to Jupiter. It's a nice 60-mile return trip, and love going up the coast. I'm a Canadian, so it's just kind of like living on vacation down here.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Jay. Excited for the content here. I know that a lot of us are very focused on around channel strategies. Our breakout session we had yesterday was around that, and Jay brings a very unique perspective on how to build a successful channel program. So Jay, we'll turn it over to you.
All right, great. Well, thank you for that. And I've been in channels now for 26 years. I was a channel leader at IBM. I was a channel leader at Lenovo, so big Fortune 500 companies. I worked at Autotask, which was acquired by Datto, who went public yesterday under the ticker symbol MSP, and now are a $3 or $4 billion company, grown out of the channel and grown out of MSPs, which is great. I was a startup founder of a mobility AI channel software company for 6 years and sold that. And now I've been at Forrester for 3 years. So got to look at this industry from all different angles. And the one thing that always comes back is that when you look at the world GDP, 75% of the world goes indirectly. You bought your last car from a dealer. You bought your last TV from a retailer. You bought your last jar of peanut butter from a grocer. When we go into the technology industry, the $3.5 trillion that businesses and governments spend every year on technology, almost 2/3 of that goes through the channel today. And it's a big industry. It's an important industry. And guess what? Everybody wants to be in the industry. So we're in a mode now in the last couple of years where there are millions of companies coming into the industry to be technology solution providers of some type. And we're in this world where every company in every industry wants to be a tech company. Every services company in every industry wants to be a services company. So you may not know that 81% of the accountants in the world are now doing tech services. You have to go to page 4 of their website to see that they'll do your taxes and audit work as well. 78% of the marketing and digital agencies are doing tech services, and they'll do some creative and other work as well. So every company is starting to rethink themselves as technology companies. So what I'm doing now is tracking this 64%, but tracking it in terms of all of these different, and there's 16 different business models out there today overlapping and converging that are out there talking enterprise technology. And given COVID and given the rush to UCaaS, this convergence, I think, is 80 to 90% there, with all of these companies thinking through telecom, thinking through communications, thinking through collaboration, thinking through all of these different things, and working with customers. So I'm going to unpack what that means and where we're going, not only in the next couple of years, but kind of give you some 5 and 10 year predictions as well. This is why. If I had one slide to explain why every company on the planet wants to become a tech company, it's the opportunity. The technology industry has been outgrowing every other industry for decades. You look at the big trillion-dollar companies, basically the stock market has moved only in one industry. The other 26 industries are flat or down, but it looks like we've recovered. It looks like, COVID was a blip on the screen. But if you remove technology from the economy, we have not recovered at all. We are actually in a recession. And so when you look at technology today, especially in the cloud, multi-cloud world, 65% of decisions are made outside of IT. So it's not the CIO, it's not the CTO, it's not the CISO. It is the head of marketing. It's the head of sales, the head of operations, the head of finance, the head of HR, who are making 2/3 now of cloud decisions. So these line of business buyers have become important. Again, if you're an accountant and you've called on the CFO forever, it's now a technology conversation. If you're a digital agency or marketing agency, you've called on the CMO forever. In many companies now, the head of marketing spends more on technology than the head of IT. So the shifting landscape of enterprise technology is one of the biggest changes driven through the cloud. And there's huge opportunities here to drive revenue in those numbers. And the traditional channel has been very slow to introduce themselves to these new buyers. The next thing is, for decades, we've been talking about verticalization, becoming that healthcare specialist as a partner. Well, the fact is nobody's an industry specialist anymore. They're going into the sub-industries. You're a specialist at a 50-doctor mid-sized clinic. You're a specialist in dentist offices or in small hospitals. The sub-layers below the 27 big industries, which is 297 sub-industries, is where the focus is. Geographically, if that mid-sized clinic is here in Florida, if it's up in New York, if it's in California, very different. Legislation, regulation, different nuances in terms of how do you go to market. If you move that clinic to Toronto or London in the UK, huge differences. So the fact of the matter is geographic knowledge is extremely important and a focus area. The sector, size, and segment of the customer. If you focus on SMB, there's 10 segments inside SMB alone with very different buying cycles and resources and capabilities. And then finally, in this industry for 39 years, we've been talking about hardware, software, and services. Well, today we look at 26 different categories of product. It's not just the 3 anymore. So if you want to have a security conversation, there's 7 layers below security. And then there's about 17 layers below that. So it's difficult just to have a security conversation without drilling in to find out the subcategory of technology that you're talking about. So if I took all this and I took those 16 different business models and multiplied it all together, there are 35 million customer conversations going on every day. So if you service that head of marketing at that mid-sized clinic and you check off some of these, very specific focus areas, this is a very big heat map and a huge amount of opportunity for players to enter the market. So given that we're in October, we're in the 3rd stage of COVID, we get to talk to 690,000 people every year through survey and through advisory and inquiry and things like that. I wanted to kind of capture out of the hundreds of different areas of spend where the top 4 are for the next 12 months. And this is where, partners who are aligning themselves to these trends are seeing the most success and the biggest growth today. Number 1, far and away, the leader is automation. So COVID and the pandemic, and in most parts of the US, pandemonium and murder hornets somewhere in the middle, has created a different environment. So the pandemic was the first human failure for over 100 years. And so as we know, processes and workflows and everything in enterprise technology built by humans have humans inside the processes as gates. They have office space inside the processes. So when we lost humans to home and when we lost access to the workspace, everything changed, and most companies, the processes broke down. So they're looking to industries like RPA, robotic process automation, business process automation, and the no-code, low-code tools within SaaS to kind of fix these workflows and processes and business logic. And so before COVID, RPA was the fastest growing sub-industry in the world, all industries. So the biggest company, UiPath, that most people haven't heard of, last year grew 5,614%. If you're at a cocktail party and want a funny thing to say, the fastest growing company in our industry ever to 100 million is UiPath. It was Microsoft. They got replaced by Salesforce. They got replaced by Slack. But now the biggest, fastest growing company in this industry is now an RPA company. And they're doing really, really well during COVID. We've seen the cloud acceleration numbers, but let me just frame it up. Now that we're 2 quarters into COVID, we've got real results. We know that computer infrastructure is down by 17%. We know that telecom hardware is down by 16%. We know that tech consulting and system integration is down by 15%. On the other end of the scale, Microsoft Azure reported 47% growth, AWS 44, Google Cloud 41. If you look at the big SaaS companies, Salesforce, ServiceNow, Marketo, Workday, NetSuite, they're all up by 30. There is literally a 70% swing to low performing to high performing categories. Managed services as a business model is right in the middle. It's down by 1.9%. So it's been resilient. The recurring model is the right one, but that just goes to show you that they are stuck in the middle. Their business is lagged by this drop of 15 to 17% of their core business, and they're not taking advantage of these growing businesses in the 30s and 40s to the extent they need to. This new COVID has created a different future of work, as we all know. And every day we hear about companies delaying back to work. We're hearing about more permanent work from home scenarios. Right now, we're forecasting about 30% of people will forever change their future of work. So this new topology, where there's mystery, there's margin in the channel. When we moved to client server, for example, in the 1980s, 1990s, the managed services industry was born out of that total cost of ownership. When we moved to cloud, multi-cloud, that disrupted a lot of what I showed and why we have 16 different kinds of companies participating. Now we're into a third topology. We have people at home on consumer notebooks, going through a consumer network, going into a consumer router that you share with your neighbor at the front street, trying to get access to enterprise class data and systems. So the amount of risk and compliance and security and continuity and redundancy and all the things that go with this very different network topology plays right into the hands of channel partners who know how to do this. Instead of setting up branch environments and SD-WAN and wider area networks, now you're in residential. But companies that were balking at outsourcing some or all of their IT, whether on security or in remote management, are now looking at this and saying, they can't manage that last mile, which is a huge opportunity for the channel. The last thing in terms of opportunity is that companies are moving out of, after 6 or 7 months, they're moving out of survival mode in most industries. There's some that are not, but they're moving into a thrive mode. They're starting to ask the questions of where they can spend money in enterprise technology that's going to, not only have them survive this crisis, but thrive and come out of it stronger. They're looking back to 2008. They're looking back to 2001. They're looking at opportunities of where they're going to spend money. And this is the areas that they are. So every company in every industry has obviously changed their customer experience, whether it's curbside pickup, it's obviously e-commerce and marketplace. It is employee experience. This has obviously been a very taxing year for all of us, for all of our employees, for all of our customers' employees, for all of our partners' employees. So HR and employee experience has been, a big area of growth. So this is the fourth biggest opportunity, is where they're actually turning to take their company out of this pandemic and working on these type of projects. So that frames up kind of the last piece, is the big predictions. Many of these were around, and I published these last year in a piece I do every December called What I See Coming for the Channel. And all of them have been accelerated because of COVID. And I did not predict the pandemic. I did not predict pandemonium. I did not predict murder hornets. So I may not be a good forecaster, but these are the trends that are moving the channel or transforming the channel and the broader ecosystem the most. And when I say the most, more change this year than I've seen in 39 years combined. Probably the biggest change I mentioned earlier when I mentioned 65% of decisions happening outside of IT, not in procurement, not on an RFP. In a subscription model, these buyers are different. They're putting it on departmental credit cards. And I know everybody dialed in here. This is your expertise in terms of how this is working. And the fact of the matter is there's a lot of risk in this, but we study their psychology. We study their behaviors. We get very, very granular on what this new digital journey looks like in terms of these buyers. So what we're getting focused on from a channel perspective is this digital journey. So we just did a big piece of work, which we call the future of buying. So we look at these buyers, we look at how they buy. I'll save you 1,000 pages of reading. The conclusion is the future business or enterprise technology buyer will look a lot like a consumer. We're going through a demographic change as well. So we're within 4 years now of the majority of buyers in these departmental roles being millennials. And now Generation Z has entered the marketplace. So as you start to look at these numbers, this digital journey, so buying software, buying telecom, buying hardware is going to look a lot like buying a car. And how you move through that early digital journey, the moments that you have, the Google search, the peer networks, the social networks, the conversation with your neighbor, the battle cards, the videos on YouTube, all the things you do to get really smart, smarter than that salesperson when you walk into that dealership, is happening in enterprise technology. So getting obsessed over this early journey is what's separating the success of one partner versus the next. Getting a seat at the table is critical. On average, 5 different partners play in this early journey. The scariest number out of all of this is the majority of technology buyers today reach vendor selection without ever talking to a salesperson or ever filling out a web form with the correct information. So in other words, they're avoiding the marketing and sales cycle at the vendor, at the distributor, at the partner, and they're getting to vendor selection without anyone knowing. So you may have lost a deal without ever knowing there was a deal. This is the biggest change that's happening. The other change, which I kind of mentioned quickly, is it's not a single throat to choke. There is no trusted advisor anymore. There is on average 5 different influencers in this early journey. So it ends up starting to look like this. When I showed all those different boxes of different kinds of partner types, there are 35 million potential customers in the middle of this chart. And there is a random chaos theory of influence that wraps around them. And how they get to vendor selection and how they fill up the room with those 5 different virtual chairs of influence is up to vendors now and up to distributors and others to figure out how to play those odds. And this is what it starts to look like in the industry. So for 39 years, we've been squarely in the middle. We focused on the transaction. We focused on gold, silver, bronze programs. We focused on, everything that came before that. It was pretty traditional procurement or RFPs. Enterprise technology buying was always pretty predictable in the client server world, for example, where I spent 17 years with IBM and Lenovo. Well, this early digital journey has evolved to the fact where there are companies now that are built around these business models. Affiliates, advocates, ambassadors. These are, things that we would have seen in the consumer world. I'm not talking about Kim Kardashian on Instagram here, but I am talking about highly connected influencers and super connectors that earn a seat at that table that as a vendor, if you're not plugged into, you may have lost a deal before ever knowing there was a deal. So we're getting obsessed over that early journey. The second part of it, post-transaction, is in a full subscription consumption world. Everything moves after transaction, which is only the first 30 days with the customer. So now you're looking at partnerships to drive adoption of your product, which drives renewals and retention. You need to drive partnerships that drive integration, which makes your product more sticky, less likely to be unplugged, drives retention. And then finally, every 30 days forever, the customer journey now never ends. You need to upsell and cross-sell your broader portfolio into that customer. So you need to build this retention channel. So there is no channel anymore. There's a trifurcated channel, which goes by a different name, ecosystem. So Accenture went and did a piece of work, and they talked to every CEO in every company, in every geography, in every industry around the world. And 76% of them came back and think that their current business model will be unrecognizable in 5 years. 76%. The number one reason why? Ecosystems. Which, if you unpack that, I'm going to go jump out of the industry for a minute. You start looking at CEOs and you look at their, their companies that they run. This forklift has been around for a long, long time, this company. They added an Internet of Things device, which is great. It sends out 1,000 data points per second, not only on the location, the humidity, how much this thing is lifting, which is the only thing forklifts actually do, and 1,000 other data points a second. The construction company, the builder, the architects are all getting this data. They're building bigger, faster, better, cheaper buildings. Great outcome. Well, guess what? Their route to market now, if you go look at their website, they look more like Tesla. They're a tech company. Look at this. We got these digital solutions and we connect all the dots and we're internet. They're building out. They do have a dealer network. And yeah, they do things with their dealer network, trying to train them better and incent them better and do all the things we've done for decades. But their new opportunity is the ecosystem. They're the newest partner of Microsoft and Google and AWS and IBM and Oracle and SAP and all the way down the list. They're signing up to Verizon and AT&T and T-Mobile, and they're the newest partner here in this digital ecosystem around the construction industry. And guess what it is? The central digital ecosystem forever, still next. Every company in every industry is going to have this three-part pitch very shortly. By the way, this forklift, you don't buy by the job site anymore. You don't buy it by the day. You buy it by weight, which is the outcome of what a forklift gives you. So they plug right into the outcome of the customer that they're connected to. So ecosystems are obviously different than a transacting channel. Number one, it's not anchored to the transaction itself, which is obvious, but it's about value creation. 1 + 1 = 3 in front of the customer. The access to network effects. Think about partnering with Microsoft, who is installed at every company on the planet. Having a forklift connected to Microsoft and then going to market in the construction industry is a big win for Microsoft. It's a big win for this forklift company. It's, 1 + 1 = maybe 4. And then the co-innovation, the ability for a partner to be in that ecosystem, to join with Microsoft and to join with this forklift manufacturer and go build a software product. Today, there's 175,000 ISVs. 10 years ago, there was 10,000. I predict 10 years from now, there will be 1 million ISVs. Why? Because somebody's going to partner with Microsoft, partner with this forklift, and go build a last mile piece of software that makes those 1,000 data points really sing. And they're going to create a new company. They're going to go to GoDaddy and get a new URL. They're going to go to Fiverr and get a new logo and get their kids to put them on LinkedIn. By Monday, they're a new company. This co-innovation is off the charts when you think about 35 million customer opportunities. So let's talk about subscription. It is obviously accelerating. What I was thinking a 3 to 5 year window of subscription consumption models is hitting us in the face. 12 days ago, IBM broke into 2, split off all of its services, managed services and service. When I was there in the 90s, this is what Lou Gerstner built, has now been flushed. They are now 100% subscription consumption. Well, a week before that, Michael Dell took a $100 billion company with 7 different companies underneath, EMC, VMware, and all the different technologies under Dell. They're 100% consumption subscription based in the next few years because of COVID. Well, if you missed that one, a week before that, Chuck Robbins at Cisco announced the exact same thing because of COVID. Cisco, you're not going to be able to buy a router. You're not going to be able to buy a switch. Guess what? It's now by the month, and that's how it's going to evolve. And we know that HPE started this last year with GreenLake. It's hard to find an HPE product today that isn't by the month. So I could go through another 100 examples, but you could imagine that every company across the entire enterprise technology space will be fully subscription consumption based, probably within 3 years now. It is a change that is monumental for the channel and for everyone else. One of the ways I get to study this, by the way, is I publish the ecosystem technology that makes it all work. So for the 10,000 companies that are in our industry that sell through partners, they use one of these pieces of software or multiple in their tech stack to service partners, to make them smarter, to onboard them, to incent them, to market to, through, and with them, to do the billing or CPQ. There's a new category on the bottom right called ecosystem management. So how do you do these influencers, affiliates, and advocates? There are companies that came out of consumer here that are raising huge money out of private equity to move that into B2B, so that these 10,000 companies have something to attribute revenue to these influencers. How do you work a retention channel with everybody now subscription every 30 days forever to do the adoption, integrations, and upsell? Well, there's companies now building that out in their roadmap. So by looking at these companies every quarter and looking at their 18-month roadmap, I get to roll up what the future is going to be based on the technologies that they're building and what customers are asking them for. So number 5, this changes everything from enterprise technology. It is completely moved away from, front and back end margin. So I've hopefully stated with enough passion that the transaction part of this is becoming less and less important in a subscription model. There is no multi-million-dollar spends. There is no big RFPs. It is the first 30 days with the client. So in that role, everything kind of changes. The vendors are now working on what I call the multiplier effect. This started with Salesforce, and I'll just tell you a little story about Salesforce. A couple of years, actually last year, they announced that they studied the influence model in all of their different sales and marketing clouds and everything they do, the Tableau acquisition, the MuleSoft acquisition, and the whole company, and they studied it with Forrester, and they came to the conclusion that influence and retention, they require 250,000 new partners to double the size of their revenue from 20 to 40 in 4 years. So they're out actively recruiting 250,000 new partners. The same day they announced that, they shut down their resale program. There is no way to partner with Salesforce today to make front or back end margin on reselling a license. So the question goes, how on earth would you partner with this company when there's no money involved? Well, they got smart and they started publishing this multiplier. For every dollar of Salesforce, there's $4.65 of ecosystem opportunity that comes attached. So they got smart and broke it down. In a pie chart, 64% of that is professional services. Then they go further and say, this much of it is installation, implementation, integration, security, compliance, business continuity, data. I mean, they'll rip through the 17 tech services, exactly the amount up against $1 of licensing, exactly what the margin is. In your zip code, they'll show you the demand. They'll show you the skills. They'll introduce you into Trailhead and build you skills and practices to go take advantage of it. That's their whole pitch. Because we want all the money to go on the app exchange. We want to own it like Apple owns it or Microsoft or all these other trillion-dollar companies. That's what we want. Because by the way, that's what Wall Street wants. Why did Salesforce, a small $20 billion company, become more valuable than Oracle, in a few weeks ago? Why did they get added to the Dow 30 and kick Exxon off the Dow 30, a $20 billion SaaS company? Well, because everybody on Wall Street assumes they're going to be the next trillion-dollar company 10 years from now. So if you're thinking through your 401k, or if you're thinking through, how all this works from a marketplace perspective and from an ownership perspective, this multiplier becomes everything. So 2 weeks ago, Google announced their multiplier is $5.32 if you're working on Google Cloud. That number, by the way, is going up to $7.80 5 years from now. But that should tell every customer of theirs, this is their total cost of ownership that we've spent decades trying to hide. They're actually being outright. They're making it visible. They're saying, if you're going to buy $100,000 of Google or $100,000 of Salesforce, I hope you have $500,000 in the bank to get it to work. And that $500,000 goes to the channel at 75% margin. You have to have the right skills. You have to have the right practices and processes. You have to have the right buyer. You have to be in the room early in that journey and earn one of those chairs, or at least influence one of those people in those chairs. But everything, changes, but your opportunity, when Salesforce goes and sells this other $20 billion to go take advantage of the 100 billion that kicks out into the ecosystem at triple the margin that you would make on resell, it makes for a very pervasive argument. The average cloud deal today has 7 layers. So you may start with Salesforce, but there's 6 other companies that are going to sell on top of it through the App Exchange. You're going to need security, you're going to need AI, you're going to need communications and collaboration, you're going to need some hardware, you're going to need some software. So all of this comes into things. You may start that deal with Salesforce, but this starts to show you what that multiplier is. The last thing I'm going to talk about is marketplaces, because I'd be remiss if I didn't. The marketplace, which has been steadily growing for a decade, has grown more in the last 3 months during COVID than the last 10 years combined. So if you're thinking about, enterprise technology, the way it's procured, the way it's managed, the way it's monitored, the way it's governed, all the things that ETMA does, I would be staring and getting obsessed over this reporting. This is, by the way, by McKinsey using Forrester research. If you look into this, we know it on the consumer side. Like probably right now, I've got 6 Amazon boxes waiting for me out the front door. 1/3 of the US economy is now done through e-commerce. 1/3. And if you actually look at the B2B side of it, the business side of it, it is, trailing behind this, but it's on the same hockey stick. And when I said that the future B2B technology buyer looks a lot like a consumer, you can imagine that these two things are going to be pretty correlated as we go through the next 10 years. Before we even got into COVID, 73% of technology buyers think that marketplaces are very convenient. Being able to provision and procure in one place, being able to manage, monitor, and measure in one place, being able to go to my CFO and say that, hey, I'm not just a, rogue shadow channel out here buying stuff. I get it all managed. Look, here's App Exchange. It's 80% of my, purchasing is done through one place. I can happily share the dashboard with you, and we can happily work together on making sure it's optimized and everything else. So it's lifting some of that work from where it would be in the organization and procurement and other places right back to the buyer. So here's the offshoot of that. In the technology world, I was predicting 17% of the top line revenue of Microsoft and AWS and IBM and SAP and Oracle and even into telco, into the major Ring Centrals and 8x8s and all the players. 17% of their top end revenue would go through marketplace by 2023. Given what we've seen in the last 3 months, this is going to happen next year. So it's not just a sideshow anymore. It's now double digits. It creates one of the larger routes to market. So now when you talk to 8x8 or Ring Central or Star2Star or Wildix or whoever you're talking to, the fact of the matter is, if they don't go and compete on the App Exchange and compete at Microsoft and AWS and Google, if they don't compete on the IBM marketplace, the Adobe marketplace, the SAP marketplace, the Oracle marketplaces, if they're not competing across the top 20, what we think is super winners, they're going to be left behind. Because back to that cake, UCaaS might not be the first layer of the cake. You may not start there, but as you're building out your marketing product or project, as you're building out your sales stack, as you're building out your customer service stack, content and collaboration and communication comes up the stack. So how you connect the telephones and how you connect the call center, how you connect the mobility side of it, how you connect all those dots starts and is executed through the marketplace. So this now we're talking in a few months. I mean, this is the hockey stick we're on, and this will probably be one of the biggest changes that we see for the next decade. So that was a quick run through. I've got many more in the research that I do. If you want to look up on Twitter or LinkedIn, you can see a link to my blog. I kind of muse on about 6 other major trends as well that are hitting partners, just maybe not as strongly as these ones because of COVID and the pandemonium and everything else we're in. And I'm not sure on timing here, but happy to take questions after the fact or through social media or what we have for timing here.
So we're running a little bit late, but let's take some quick questions and then we'll, so let's do like 5 minutes of questions. We're going to run long. We thought we would run long today. And then we'll do the rest through social media and other vehicles. So does anybody have any questions for Jay? I'm sure you do.
Hey, Joe. Yeah, this is Dave. I have a question. Do you hear me?
Yes.
You can.
Okay. Yeah, so I'm just wondering, so given that, your outlook that everything is going to marketplaces, what do you think the future of looks like for enterprise procurement departments? That's definitely a channel within an organization that I think everyone on this call has, for better or for worse, quite a bit of experience with. And just kind of how these personas are changing. How do you see procurement departments, especially for large size contracts? How do you see the impact there?
Yeah, first of all, everything isn't going marketplace. 17%, it means that 83% is still going business as usual. So there's nobody getting fired. There's nobody, getting a job change, anytime soon. The next thing is, I think you could look at the security industry as a lead bellwether of the answer to that question. When security became part of the stack and now you have a CMO or a head of HR thinking security, there's danger in that. You need a federal government to kind of wrap together the 7 threat vectors and the zero trust strategy that a company needs. So that federal government became the CISO, became into the IT department to manage all of these divisional, technology purchases. Business technology should be bought by business people, but the elements of it, the procurement, the security, the governance, the compliance, that's legal departments, that's, financial departments, that's operational departments, it's IT departments, and it's procurement. So big companies are going to look to procurement not as taking the lead of drafting an RFP or selecting a short list of vendors. They're going to become a federal government to make sure that the optimization, the monitoring, if the money does flow through, 6 different marketplaces, they're going to want to make sure that the licenses are being monitored and that there's no overpayments and that, the discounts are being applied appropriately.
Hey, Jay, it's Dave Gardner. Very interesting presentation. Thank you. I'm kind of curious. You discussed the multiplier effect and the concept of be happy to work with us as an organization from a sales perspective. We're not paying you anymore, but here's why it's so valuable. To me, there's a bit of a fallacy in that, or at least a challenge, because you've got a stack of vendors in any technology solution. So if, they're claiming 6% and Microsoft is claiming 4%, and first of all, you end up with no vendors paying anybody, and then you don't have a survivable model, right? Because everyone's claiming that just working with us is the panacea. But secondarily, you overlap so that you end up with the multiplier in one company versus 6, 7 that may be part of a solution, all overlapping. Then you don't really have a true number. And that comes from a foundation of assuming that the multiplier these organizations are coming up with actually have credibility and are reasonable to begin with. I'm curious what you think the ultimate play on that is, because again, if every vendor says, just be happy to work with us, there's no financing the channel, right?
Yeah, so you nailed it. When you have a 7-layer cake, it's not additive. You don't get 5 here and 5 there and 5 here and 5 there, and there's a panacea of money coming to you. The whole deal. Whoever's at that lower level of the cake, that first, purple layer that I showed, is the one that's producing the ecosystem value. So if this purple layer is Salesforce, all of this cake is $4.65. I mentioned 64% of it's professional services, about 17% of it's ISV. There's some hardware, there's some other things. But understanding that the purple layer here, Google has their numbers, Microsoft has their numbers, whoever earns this spot is going to brag that they generate all this revenue. And so the second part of your question, those numbers are real because I know that Forrester works on them. And I look at the 7th decimal point of that research, and it is deep. We go deep into these contracts. And when I say $100,000 Salesforce deal, we're talking to 690,000 of these customers who installed Salesforce, and we get into their P&L and we get into their contracts and we go and dig into the total cost of ownership, again, at a decimal level. So those are real numbers. I'm not concerned about that. And I could go back to my days of selling laptops and tell you that the TCO was, 5-time multiplier there for managed service providers who could charge, $100 a month to go manage that thing forever. The fact of the matter is, what you said though is in a subscription model, whatever margin you take on the first 30 days with the customer at $19 or $9 per person per month, like if you try to make a business out of Office 365, whatever margin you make on $6 a user is not going to pay your mortgage. And as every company, like, the big companies like Cisco and IBM and Dell were the ones that you could take a good margin on $1 million deal. Well, what I'm saying now is there's just going to be no $1 million deals. It's going to start as a pilot. It's going to start as a 7-layer cake. You're going to spend nickels and dimes on all this stuff. Over the course of the lifetime value of the customer, it is very rich in revenue and margin, but that all goes to the vendor. They're not going to pay you a kickback. Like telco is still paying you every month. That's going to go away as well. The fact is, it's not going to be vendor funded. It's going to be customer funded. And it's going to be very bumpy ride for partners that need to understand who the buyers are of these layers of the cake, where the money flows, and how to charge for it. All these different elements that would have been thrown in on the licensing deal and the margin that you made now has to be broken apart and line itemed. And they have to recognize that there is an expense for you rolling a truck. There's an expense for you managing or monitoring it on the back end. There's an expense for you optimizing it. For all these things you used to throw in, because you made a couple $100,000 on that $1 million deal, is gone. And you're going to have to start charging them in a menu fashion, $10 for this, $20 for this, on a monthly basis or as a project basis. This is a big change, and it's a big threat to the channel. I don't think 80% of companies are ready for it.
It's also a real challenge for the buyer, right? For the buying company who's not used to paying for it.
Well,
they're used to having it thrown in, right? They're used to being able to get more for less, which is a big current theme, right? So the buyer transition here is massive to accept that.
Well, I mean, if you're a consumer today and you think of the future business buyer as a future consumer, and I'm a millennial and I pay $12 to Netflix. I know to cross over and get some Disney content, it's going to be another $10. I know that my Spotify is $5. I used to pay the cable company $150 and it just, get 700 channels. Well, now I know that I'm paying for content, the specific channels that I want. We're getting into that mode now that, as you're early in that journey, that you understand that nothing comes from free anymore, because as an ecosystem, think of it celestial. All the stars, the moons, everything is visible. In that visible market, you're going to understand that every service, every nickel of service is actually going to be charged for. And there's no margin, there's no supply chain and distribution through partner that hides a bunch of value add. The value add has to be surfaced to the customer, and they have to understand, what and how they're paying for it. And that, I think, will be more so on a marketplace than a bunch of one-offs with Larry in the white van.
Do you think there's a big difference between the SMB and the enterprise market in terms of this transition, and also over what time frame? The two, the sides of the market scale.
There definitely is. And, the way that enterprise contracts are done will be different. Accenture and Deloitte and all the big GSIs and stuff that's all they do is they sell these big $1 million contracts. But coming out of COVID, if customers aren't doing that anymore, they're going to have to get smarter at breaking down the cake and earning, one of those 5 seats in the room. SMB, 23% of them outsource some or all of their IT to Larry, an MSP or a telco agent or sub agent. I think that'll be a bit slower for somebody running a flower shop or a daycare center to care about what the layers of the cake are. They just want the outcome. So I think enterprise will go first. I think mid-market will go second. And then SMB from the M part backwards will all go in a linear order over the next decade in terms of breaking this kind of stuff apart.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hey,
Okay.
I have a question. Oh,
We're running a little bit long, so we'll take one last question and then we'll push them to social media. We did have a chat question about, hey, can we get a copy of the presentation? We'll have PDFs out tomorrow. So look for that as well.
I have a quick question. So you had mentioned like some of the big players in the industry are switching to more of a subscription-based thing. So with IBM spinning out GTS, like what do you think their long-term strategy is with the services side of things? Like, are they going to put just as much effort into that as they are the subscription to see how it pans out? Or is this something that they'll eventually wind down on?
Yeah, you're asking me a question close to my heart because I spent 17 years working there. IBM has been a very difficult stock to watch over the last 20 years. If I were to tell you or ask you, who do you think, as a general customer, who do you think is leading in AI right now? Watson would either be number one or in the top three. Who's leading in IoT? Who's leading in blockchain? Who's leading in quantum computing? I could take you through the 20 emerging tech, and IBM has the scientists and the patents and are pretty much leading from a reputational standpoint, which is basically the future of our industry. And their stock price has gone down. Their revenue has gone down for 27 straight quarters, and they're being dragged by their legacy business. So back in the day, Lou Gerstner was offered up this opportunity to break up IBM. And back in the 90s, his decision was not to. There was more power based on enterprise technology and the way it's bought to be as one. And he made the right decision. But today, we saw HP break into two. You saw Symantec break into two. You saw Dell go private and break up. This is the model today in the stock market, because this is obviously what they're doing, is working for stockholder value. The only way IBM can be successful is they let these technologies, which you see here, cloud computing and artificial intelligence, and all those 4 buying areas that I talked about, they're all in IBM's wheelhouse. But their stock price is being dragged by having this behemoth, 450,000 people, outsourcing and doing more traditional managed services. The time has come that they have to just let that go, because they want their stock price to do more of what Microsoft and AWS and Google has done, or Salesforce is going to do. Then they want to be dragged with an SAP or an Oracle or others that are trying to do all things to all people. And that's the whole idea here. HP Inc. got into that commodity business against Lenovo, allowed HPE to do GreenLake and the key things to apply to the new economy. And it's purely a stock market play. Don't read into any further. They would love to keep it all together, but these people are all paid by making people on Wall Street rich. And the fact of the matter is, this is, I think, the only way forward for IBM.
Thank you.
Okay, that was fantastic. We really enjoyed that, Jay. A lot of good, solid information. As I said, we've had a lot of people chat in, say, hey, how do I get a copy of that presentation? A lot to mull over. People chatting in that they need to change their priorities. So I think it's going to affect us all. So crazy good. That was fantastic.
All right. Well, thanks, and thanks for having me. And hey, if we want to do another Zoom call at some point, I'm glad to jump on, and we could do a Q&A session at some point.
Perfect. Okay, I think we'll take you up on that.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Take care.